Welcome to my World History Notes, where I read from the book I wrote to teach homeschoolers, Survey of World History. A Bible believer looks at world history. You can find it on lulu.com, amazon.com, or the Bible Baptist Bookstore. Today, we're in the Americas, talking about the Inca Empire. We're kind of covering a large period of time because they rose fast and died quickly because of the Spanish invasions. But I want to go over some things. It's going to be a little bit this time. I hope you can stick with it. It's very interesting stuff. Cause you to go on and dig for yourself. So let's begin. Pachacuti's brother, Capac Yupanqui, led the Inca army in 1450 to besiege the city-state of Cajamarca in the foothills east of Timor. Cajamarca's leader was allied with Mincha Kaman, who then came to his aid. After an ambush set by Yupanqui, Mincha Kaman was forced to retreat from Cajamarca. Yupanqui was so successful that his brother, Pachacuti, was afraid he might want the throne, so he had him executed on his return home at the head of his victorious army to Cusco, their capital. 10 years later, according to Spanish chronicles, excuse me, Pachacuti sent out another army under his own son, the person he had designated as his successor, Thupa Inca Yupanqui. The Incas were now taken very seriously. By threatening its water supply, the Inca paralyzed Timor's defenses and took Mincha back to Cusco along with his artisans, determined to make their capital greater than Chan Chan. When the Spanish conqueror Pizarro held his victory celebration in Cusco 70 years later, it was a city more opulent and beautiful than anything he'd ever seen in Europe. Pachacuti's successful 25-year effort to build an empire was done often in a surprisingly peaceful manner with, quote, foreign aid and an ever-growing influence in the soon-to-be conquered cities and regions until there was no question of Inca primacy. He spent a great deal of his time building his lavish capital to reflect his own glory, as emperors often do. At the heart of Cusco was the Plaza of Akipata, 625 feet by 550 feet, carpeted with white sand carried in from the Pacific and raked daily by the city's armies of workers. Large villas and temples surrounded the square on three sides, their walls made from immense blocks of stone, cut so precisely and fit so tight that Pizarro's younger cousin Pedro reported that a pin could not be inserted into the joints. Across the front of the buildings were enormous plates of polished gold. When the sun filled the plaza with its white sand and its sheets of gold, it was filled with light and quite impressive. The plaza was the center of the empire, and to the Inca, the center of the universe. The network of spiritually powerful lines called zeki that linked the holy sites such as tombs, shrines, and other landmarks called waka were so complex and difficult to understand that the Inca had, according to the Spanish, 1,000 men whose job it was just to remember what went to what. One big stone outside of the city was believed to be the petrified body of one of the original Inca brothers who founded the culture and was often carried with the armies dressed in fine clothes as a sort of talisman. By 1491, the Inca ruled the largest empire on earth. It was bigger than Ming Dynasty China, larger than Ivan the Great's Russia, larger than the Songhai Empire in Africa, Zimbabwe, the Ottoman Empire, or any European state at that time. The empire encompassed every conceivable type of terrain, from the rainforest of the Amazon to the deserts of the Peruvian coast to the snow-capped heights of the Andes Mountains. They attempted to unite a large group of different people with different languages and regions, different languages and religion into one entity, speaking only Runa Sumi, the Inca language. They practiced an Assyrian type of removal where entire populations were transported to foreign areas and forced to work on government projects, moving them around the largest system of roads on the planet. To organize this vast empire, they developed a unique system of writing based on a series of knots on string that formed a binary code similar to today's computer languages. The Inca homeland is not only high, but very steep, with slopes of more than 65 degrees in many places. It is amazing that so many people lived in such vulnerable circumstances. By combining foods and products from many different environments to exchange between the many varied people in the empire, the Incas managed to live a better life than any one ethnic group could have maintained on their own. The empire grew fast and was short-lived, lasting less than 100 years. As early as 1350, they were a relatively unimportant people, but legend has it, told by Spanish chroniclers, that a family of four brothers and four sisters left the region around Lake Titicaca for some unknown reasons and wandered until they arrived at the site of their future capital of Cusco. Archaeologists claim that this migration began around 1200. They slowly became more powerful until a confrontation with another group, the Chenca, in 1438 led to a war that was won by a leader who refused to run, Inca Yupanqui, who captured many Chenca leaders and skinned them alive in victory celebration. This Inca Yupanqui, after winning a dispute against his father, declared himself Pachacuti and stated that all Inca emperors were descended from the sun. He then went about conquering everything he saw. The Inca homeland was called Tawantinsuyu, or Land of the Four Quarters. It was a socialist state where every citizen owed the government forced labor and where everything belonged to the government, especially to the Inca emperor personally. The state fed and clothed all work gangs as they built dams, terraces, and irrigation canals, grew crops on state lands, raised herds on state pastures, and made pottery in state factories. They paved highways and supplied the runners and llamas carrying messages and goods that ran along with them that ran along them. The Inca emperor was treated as a god. He was carried on a golden litter as he did not walk in public. People left the roads when he passed, climbing the hillsides, worshiping and adoring him. One of the expressions of adoration was to pull out their eyelashes and eyebrows, according to one Spanish chronicler named Gamboa. His servants collected and stored every item he touched, body waste included, to make sure that no lesser human being touched them and profaned their sacredness. The ground was not good enough to receive the Inca emperor's saliva, so he spat in the hand of a special servant who wiped it on a special cloth and stored it for safekeeping. Once a year, everything touched by the Inca leader, including his bedding, clothing, garbage, and saliva, was burned in a ceremony. Thupa Inca, the 10th Inca emperor, started the practice of the emperor marrying his sister in order to maintain the purity of the royal line. The Inca's sister wife would accompany him on military expeditions with up to 1,000 concubines or subordinate wives. This didn't seem to slow him down, as by 1493, Thupa Inca had sent armies deep into current day Ecuador and Chile, doubling the empire. With so many potential heirs around and the many offspring produced, it was common for the person who would succeed the emperor to start killing his brothers and then picking a sister to marry. The 11th Inca, Huayna Capac, was an organizer rather than a conqueror, and he focused on government works projects, even making a work crew move a small mountain just to keep them busy. Spanish conquistadors reported several roads leading from the same towns, each one built by a different Inca emperor. Much information we have about the Inca comes from Spanish sources who interviewed the vanquished in great detail to understand their history. In 1615, the writer Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala presented a massive history of the Incas with over 500 drawings to the King of Spain. It is now a fundamental source of information on the empire. Uncharacteristically, Huayna Capac went on an expedition to southern Ecuador, where he was born on one of his father's military expeditions. And he liked it so much, he had a great palace built at a city now called Cuenca and sent Atahualpa on to conquer a few more provinces with his generals. This expedition was beaten badly, and even when Huayna himself returned to lead his armies, he was humiliated in defeat by jungle people who refused to be subdued. He finally died in his Ecuadorian palace. A bloody succession battle followed, and it seems on his deathbed, he passed over Atahualpa, who had not impressed him in battle, and chose another son, who died of the same illness even before the emperor. He then picked another son whom priests said was not favored by the gods, but when they tried to report this to Huayna, they found that he'd already died. The court nobles settled on the 19-year-old boy he had chosen, but whom the priests had rejected. Atahualpa stayed in Ecuador supposedly because he knew his life expectancy would be short if he went back to the capital. Huayna Capac's mummified body was dressed in fine clothing and taken back to Cuzco on a gold litter covered with feathers. Noblemen plotted to kill the new boy emperor and install someone else on the throne. Realizing this danger, with Atahualpa having stayed behind in Ecuador with the majority of the Inca army, the 19-year-old emperor Huáscar had all the nobles executed. Since Huayna Capac had not married Huáscar's mother, it was commanded that she marry the mummy in an elaborate ceremony in order to make his succession legitimate. He then married his sister over the objections of his mother, who did not seem to have too much of a problem marrying her dead brother. Civil war immediately followed that seesawed over the Andes Mountains for 3 years. Initially, the advantage went to Huáscar, who even went to Ecuador and captured Atahualpa, who nearly lost one of his ears as if it was almost torn off in his capture. In the stockade, Atahualpa had one of his wives smuggle him a weapon by which he dug his way out. It seems that his guards had gotten drunk and allowed a conjugal visit to take place, during which the wife's sister snuck in the tools necessary for escape. He reassembled his army on a plateau today, I mean, near today's Peru-Ecuadorian border. The forces led by Atahualpa destroyed Huascar's army. 10 years later, the Spanish chronicler Cieza de Leon personally saw the battlefield and estimated the number of the fallen by the remains of the unburied dead to be about 16,000. Huascar's main general was captured and beheaded. A bowl was mounted to his skull with a spout between his teeth, and Atahualpa used it as a cup to drink intoxicating chica. Huascar and Atahualpa met in a huge battle at the head of their armies in a final battle that De Leon estimated cost the lives of 35,000 soldiers. Huascar was captured in an ambush and was taken captive to Cusco, where he was forced to watch his wives, children, and relatives loyal to him killed in front of his eyes. In October or November of 1532, the victors learned that a pale, hairy people who sat on enormous animals had landed on the coast. Atahualpa, curious, was content to wait for the new visitors to come to him. Pizarro, leader of the expedition of only 168 Spanish soldiers, managed to arrange the place of the meeting with the emperor. At Cachamarca on November 16, 1532, the Spanish, vastly outnumbered by thousands of Inca, armed only with ceremonial weapons, specifically for meeting with the aliens, had hid their horses and cannon out of sight. The Spanish were so scared of this mighty emperor and his large army that Pizarro wrote that many men wet themselves in terror while waiting. A Spanish priest presented Atahualpa with a breviary, which is a book containing hymns and prayers, which, as it meant nothing to him, was promptly and contemptuously thrown aside. This was to the Spanish a legitimate reason to attack. The attacking Spanish, mounted on horses and metal armor, firing cannons, none of which the Inca had ever seen or heard before, routed the thousands of Inca troops in a stampede that tramples hundreds to death. Atahualpa was captured after Pizarro personally grabbed him and dragged him from his litter. His personal servants were so loyal that when the Spanish cut off their hands, they still tried to hoist the emperor's litter on their shoulders. Pizarro was not impressed with his victory, as his writings reveal that he knew he had marched his men into the jaws of a great empire, and his greed and lust for gold was more than matched by his fear. Atahualpa realized early on that gold and precious metals had power over the European mind in a way they did not over the Inca, because the Inca had no currency. He offered to fill a room 22 feet by 17 feet full of gold objects in return for his freedom. Pizarro agreed to his offer. Atahualpa had his generals strip Cuzco of its silver and gold. Having not actually lived in the city since his youth, he had no attachment to it. At the same time, he had the captive Huascar killed and all of his own surviving brothers to ensure that no one would ally themselves with the invader against him. Between December of 1532 and May of 1533, caravans of gold and silver flooded into Cajamarca on the backs of llamas. Without the emperor, the entire land of Tawantinsuyo was frozen. No man was able to act against the Spaniards. It was the nature of the empire, absolute control from the top and no action without the emperor's will or word. The Spaniards were not able to handle the tension, the expectation of being massacred at any moment. They did not keep their part of the bargain. They strangled Atahualpa. Then they marched on Cuzco. One fell stroke, a motley band of 168 soldiers and priests had destroyed the largest contiguous empire on earth at that time. The Incas were defeated by superior technology, but in the long run, it was their inability to act independently against a common threat that finished them. Now, I'm going to continue this next time. I have some more comments to make about the Incas and their fall and disease and things like that. But we'll stop for today. And I thank you for watching. I hope you'll stick with me.